Hello everybody, I'm Philip J. Watt. This is the Conscious Society YouTube channel, and today we've got a new guest, one in which I've recently come across his work and am very excited to share the information that he can provide you with. You know, it's so holistic, it's so approachable, and it's so logical around dealing with the issues we have in today's system. So his name is Robert David Steele. He is a former CIA agent, a political analyst, a writer, like an activist as well. One of his recent books, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, is the Open Source Everything Manifesto. And he's also got a recent book, I think it was 2015, on electoral reform, which is what I do want to talk about at a later stage as well. But before we go into it any further, welcome to the program, Robert.
Well, thank you very much. I will just make one correction. CIA agents are the ones who commit treason. CIA officers are the ones that recruit them. I was an officer, not an agent.
Okay, my bad. It's good for clarification. Now, look, you're a smart guy, Robert. I've seen what you've, quite a few of your interviews, and a lot of the information that you talk about is from an intelligence perspective on what is really going on in the world. And some of your views, some of your analysis, some people might consider as conspiratorial, but this is really important information that we all need to start accepting and incorporating into our knowledge repertoire so we can move forward and actually deal with some of the problems that we do have, both socially and environmentally today. So the interview, I guess, I want to look at a bit of a general...
Let me stop you just for a second, please. I want to make an important point. CIA invented the term conspiracy theorist in the 1960s, specifically to minimize the people who were questioning the government account of the John F. Kennedy assassination. So you are absolutely on a hugely important track when you recognize that people who are called conspiracy theorists may actually be, in fact, truth tellers that the governments are trying to marginalize.
Well, that's right. And the dynamic has changed over the last 5-10 years anyway, where in the past a conspiracy theorist was looked at as a tinfoil hat wearing, person, compared to now where it's about truth seeking. It's about, critical analysis and actually trying to figure out what is going on in the world. So all those old school sledges and just general derogative sort of approaches to people who want to understand this information just does not apply anymore. Okay.
Well, let me just say, if you're just a very quick thing, if you want to go back and forth often, is at phibetaiota.net. If your listeners will enter the word conspiracy or conspiracy theory, they will get to a number of very important posts, including one that lists 33 conspiracy theories now proven true.
Yes, the mainstream narratives, the social engineering, the social programming has been exposed. The bullshit, propaganda from the corporate and matrix media has been really well uncovered by the alternative and independent media. And we should really be starting to celebrate the good, fine work that people like yourself and also the independent journalists who actually stand up for truth and justice have done to reshape, reincorporate the truth back into the collective consciousness of humanity.
Well, I would agree with you, except that one of the problems that we're having is that no more than 20% of the public has woken up yet. We haven't reached a tipping point. And I am hoping that the American election and some other things going on in the world, including a massive economic global reset, including the public exposure of some greater banking crimes than most people realize exist, could in the next few years make that tipping point happen.
Yeah, it's estimated that around 10% of the population is required to sort of,
in theory, I think it's closer to 20 to 25% now.
Well, I think at the end of the day, many people are awake in various forms. So I think it's very difficult just to say you're awake or you're asleep. It's more so that you're awake around certain subjects, around certain information, and maybe not so about others. You know, there's a whole paradigm of a new paradigm of information that's making its way through the consciousness of humanity. But it has to do with not just political and social and systemic stuff, but also about the philosophy and the spiritual stuff as well. So, but this is a great segue into sort of my first question. So, what really is going on in terms of who is, I guess, managing world affairs?
Well, the really sad thing is that world affairs are not being managed as much as the Rothschilds and the banking families are making money from both sides of conflict. If you go back in history, the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, most wars would not have been possible if the banking families had not provided credit to both sides. And so what we really have is a paradigm in which a select group profits from human misery, and it profits from destruction. It profits from treating the 99% as cannon fodder, being sent into illegal, illicit, unnecessary wars, and as slave labor. We actually have more slaves in U.S. prisons today, thank you to Bill and Hillary Clinton, than existed at the beginning of the American Civil War, which, by the way, was the War of Secession. It wasn't a civil war because the South didn't want to control the whole. They simply wanted to secede. So banking is in charge, and there have been a number of books you haven't mentioned, but I am the top Amazon reviewer for nonfiction. I read in 98 categories. The portal to all of my reviews, including my economic and financial reviews, is at phi-beta-iota.net at the reviews page. And so what you have is a situation in which there are multiple centers of power, but the one that has been dominant has been the financial fraudsters. And I give Matt Taibbi a lot of credit for his great book, Griftopia. And when I mention a book, I have written a summary review of that book. And if it's not visible at Amazon, it's visible at Phi-Beta-Iota. Now, what's changing is that the original gold and land families, primarily out of China and Indonesia, and with some help from Russia and Africa and South America, are now staging, in essence, a rebalancing of the global economic situation. As you know, the BRICS, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I would add Indonesia to that, and perhaps Turkey and Iran as well. They have essentially set the stage for burying the Rothschilds and for killing the SWIFT banking system and for creating an alternative development, humanitarian-oriented system, which is what we all thought was going to come out of Bretton Woods. Now, I'm a huge truth and reconciliation guy. I absolutely do not want to put a snake in a corner. It is very, very important, I think, that we negotiate a soft landing for the people who will be keeping their billions, but losing the power to manipulate human misery.
Are they really going to give up their New World Order paradigm and plans, though, Robert?
Well, you know, I asked a question, and you can see it at Phi Beta Iota. I asked the question. I grew up, I was educated in Asia. I know a number of senior Asians, and I actually asked the question, why have the Rothschilds not been assassinated? And you can read the answer at phi-beta-iota.net, looking up what I have put as a comment, the Chinese perspective combined with truth and reconciliation. And what it boils down to is it would have been quite simple to begin killing off the Rothschilds, starting with their grandchildren, which is where I would start, and then work your way up until the elders get it. I don't think more than 10 people would have to die before they would get it. But as my Chinese contact from Singapore has said, governing China is a massively complex endeavor. And in fact, the Rothschilds are going down under their own cognizance. In fact, I really salute Lady Lynn Rothschild. She's a babe from New Jersey who married well. Lady Lynn Rothschild sponsored a conference which really attracted my attention and impressed me greatly. In May of 2014, she sponsored a conference on inclusive capitalism. That's code for stop the pitchforks, please don't shoot my Learjet down with a 50 caliber bullet, which I have 20 million guys that know how to shoot down Learjets with 50 caliber bullets. I mean, if you want to see the end of the wealthy set, just continue to piss us off. So I really think we're heading toward a peaceful resolution. The Asian Dragon Society, the gold people, the land people, the people that are in charge of very, very serious segments of demography, including the Muslims, are all coming together and basically saying, that's it, enough. We're rebooting, we're resetting the global system. And I believe that's going to happen in the next 5 years.
So when you say Rothschilds, I mean, before I move into that, Truth and Reconciliation, just to reinforce for the audience, is about exposing what reality is, accepting that there has been some, very criminal and fraudulent activity, but to let them off the hook for it, let them keep their money, and just so that people can take back the power and start controlling and managing our affairs like we bloody well should have been for a long time.
Yes, and I would say that while Nelson Mandela demonstrated one variation of Truth and Reconciliation, he didn't go far enough. When I say they can keep their billions, I mean to say they can keep their position of wealth and their billions in the bank, if you will, but they will no longer secretly own the gold mines. They will no longer be allowed to control South African gold and diamonds, for example. Those things revert to the public and begin generating profits for the public rather than for a very small select group that has absolutely no right to own those natural resources. The Netherlands is an example, and Norway are examples of public ownership of natural resources. The United States is not a good example.
No, neither is Australia. Now, you talked about the Rothschilds, but there are more interconnected families involved in this process. And I've also seen you say in a previous interview that some billionaires have actually split, or they're going in a different direction, as you said, with Lady Rothschild. So are there more people involved than just the Rothschilds? And what is the dominating ideology, i.e. Zionism, Jesuits, is it Khazarian Mafia? There's a lot of confusion and debate around what is that, and even Satanism as well is one that's thrown around as well. So what is your view on the ideology, and who are these people?
Well, let me give you a general closing comment, but as we agreed, this is not going to be the main thrust of this overall interview. The Rothschilds, the name is well known, and what most people don't realize is that their wealth is equally matched by Chinese and Indonesian families that go back beyond and before the Rothschilds. But others have documented the 300 corporations that are controlled by the 10 banks, which are controlled by the 1 to 2 families. All right. What really matters, and Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, a man that I deeply admire, he's passed away. He said in an interview some years ago that demography is destiny. There aren't enough guns on the planet to keep us all down. And we've now reached that tipping point. Now, there are varying ideologies. My particular concern is that pedophilia, Satanism, and fascism have been much too current within some of these circles, not all of them. But Epstein, the American, is an example of an American pedophile. He has a Caribbean island. And Bill Clinton, who obviously hasn't been serviced by his wife in the last 30 years, made no fewer than 11 trips in 24 months to this child sex slave island. This is 11 documented trips by former President Bill Clinton. He's no longer entitled to be called President Clinton, by the way. So I really don't want to get into that as much as to say that there is an arrogance. Now, this Frenchman did an excellent book in which he pointed out that most of the wealthy today have inherited their wealth, and they have not really earned their wealth. And so I believe that the American election, and I don't think Hillary Clinton is going to be the nominee. I believe she will be indicted, and she will watch the election, if not from a courtroom, from Martha Stewart's former cell block in West Virginia. But this coming American election is a battle between Main Street and Wall Street. It's a battle between the public interest and private interest. And while I know that there are a number of people out there that fear Donald Trump or that consider Donald Trump explosive, unpredictable, and whatnot, I really liked what someone said the other day. He said, look, we know that Clinton is a criminal and we know that Sanders is a fraud. Trump is a roll of the dice, but our chances are better with Trump versus these other known evils. So I've published an open letter to Donald Trump, and your listeners are no doubt familiar with tiny URLs. So the tiny URL, which I think is kind of tongue-in-cheek, is Trump-so-black. Trump so black with 2 hyphens, and you'll get right to it. And it's an open letter that outlines 7 specific things Donald Trump can do to not only bring back the 50% of the American electorate that have not voted. Barack Obama was reelected by 26% of the American electorate. And I'll bring this back to your banking families by saying essentially what Donald Trump is doing is restoring democracy in the United States. And democracy is intended to be ugly.
We'll definitely re-explore the presidential candidates and the election in a moment. Just to backtrack a little bit around Satanism, for those who don't understand it, it's not about worshipping, the devil or Satan or whatnot. It is actually about worshipping yourself, thinking that you are God and that you deserve to rule over the sheep, the masses of humanity. But let's just quickly touch on the monetary system, because it is a scam, it is a fraud, and many people are waking up to this. But they still don't get it. So let's just talk about how money is created in society, why it's been hijacked, and where we could possibly go with it, i.e. a gold standard or a precious metal standard, or a people's fiat, where we run some sort of public banking system.
I am not an expert, and I don't want to pretend to be an expert. I will do this very quickly out of respect for you, but then I want to move on. Money is supposed to be backed by tangible assets, and it's supposed to be community wealth that is then allocated by community decision-making. What actually happened with the creation of the Federal Reserve and the central banking systems in history is that banks acquired the power to create money and to charge interest on money. And so they were basically fabricating money. Now, William Greider has written an excellent book called The Soul of Capitalism, in which he's pointed out that tangible assets have inflated or appreciated 5 times over the last quarter century, and financial assets have appreciated 17 times. The difference between 5 and 17 of 12 is the fraud index. Now, I personally am violently opposed to inflation. Inflation is a tax on the poor, and it is a sign that the government is not managing the economy well. But the bottom line here is we have to put the bankers out of business. They need to become grocery store clerks who manage the pennies on behalf of the public. They should not be allowed to create money. They should not be allowed to charge interest. And in fact, I believe a debt jubilee is part of the global economic reset. Because what's going to happen here, and we just saw a woman who went from 4.5 billion to zero, because everyone realized that her fraudulent claims about this magical medical solution were in fact fraudulent. And so that 4.5 billion was fraudulent wealth that was digitally created by financial speculation. So let's end it there. Bottom line for me is I think we are going to see a global reset. The people are going to be back in charge. Wealth will be based on tangible assets, and ethics will become a public interest common denominator.
It's amazing that we haven't, ensured that was a common denominator for a long time. But that's how the public really view it. They really believe that the system is, it's got its problems, but it's, it's pretty well organised, and they're doing their best. But they're not. The whole system politically and economically has been hijacked and infiltrated and taken over by these oligarchs, as you have said. Also, for those who might be interested, check out my interview with Ellen Brown, also on my channel. She is the founder of the Public Banking Institute, and you can learn more about the public banking system through that interview. Now, let's go back to Donald Trump, because you did mention that he is a roll the dice scenario. And he has been exposing some really confronting and controversial truths to the masses. But he's also been meeting with some of the people you might consider war criminals, such as Kissinger and others. So how do you see that fitting in, and why is he talking about incidents such as 9/11? Because, as we all know, anybody who's done any sort of investigation into the official story of 9/11, that it has been clearly debunked, and we need an open source investigation around what that is. So why is he talking about these things? Do you think he's doing it is he got a genuine sort of
Well, let me answer at multiple levels. I don't know Donald Trump personally. I don't speak for Donald Trump. I have written an open letter to Donald Trump. And anybody who goes to phi-beta-iota.net, if they just search for Donald Trump, they'll get a number of very important pieces that we've published about Donald Trump. Now, I think Donald Trump operates at least three different levels. And he has used some of the phrases that I used when I was running for president. I ran for president in 2012, for those of your listeners that don't know, as a Reform Party candidate. And I've written an article on how I tested the boundaries of the two-party tyranny. I wrote a book, Election 2008, Lipstick on the Pig, that is free online. And I've subsequently published Open Power on electoral reform, and I've published a number of white papers. At one level, Donald Trump is a brilliant businessman who understands how to assess a situation and play the media. Most of his statements about building a wall, about barring Muslims, are theatrical statements. They were intended to win the hearts and minds of the hardcore Republican base that has been abused by the financial and political elites, including particularly the Republican Party elites, who have absolutely no interest in serving the public. They are, and I have a wonderful graphic of this big eagle with the Joker face, with two wings, one red, one blue, and it says one bird, two wings, same crap. There is zero difference between the Republican Party candidates for the office of president and the Democratic Party candidates for the office of president, including Bernie Sanders, who is a Democrat. He's just a fraud as an independent and socialist. Donald Trump is the wild card, okay? Donald Trump figured out how to read the tea leaves. And he figured out how to use public statements to not only grab those votes, despite electoral fraud. The Republicans actually tried to steal primaries from Donald Trump the way they stole primaries from Ron Paul. But they failed because Trump was simply a bus driving through. Now, so at level one, he's a master businessman. He reads the tea leaves, and he literally plays the public and the media like a fiddle. Okay? At a second level, and this is, I think, his weakest level, Donald Trump is a one-man show. I have been trying, since I published an article on how Trump could win in August of 2015 in Counterpunch, I've been trying to connect with Trump through his so-called staff and a number of his surrogates. And I finally turned to a multimillionaire who's a top dollar donor to the Republican Party. And I said, hey, what's going on here? And he said, Robert, there is no campaign. There is no structure. There is no national coordination. I'm quoting here from what's on my open letter online. He said, there's no desire to connect with state and local. Chaos is reigning supreme. So what we have right now is Donald Trump with no bench. Okay? Corey Ludkowski's an idiot, the guy behind Trump as his so-called campaign manager. And most of Trump's surrogates are basically in the servant class. They're not actually serious movers and pushers. At the third level, coming to your 9/11 thing, I'm not sure. So let's say Trump is a master in one level, he's weak at the second level, and he's a roll of the dice at the third level. I don't know. The third level is where the truth comes forth. Now, Donald Trump has been photographed with Rudy Giuliani, who is a massive, avid cross-dresser and beloved by the elite of New York for his cross-dressing and related tendencies. Okay? Presumably, Donald Trump knows Rudy Giuliani in a very intimate way, and he knows that Giuliani probably shouldn't be in charge of a commission. And Donald Trump probably knows that 9/11, Richard Gage has done tremendous work. I have enormous respect for the architects and engineers for 9/11. And I like to point out to people that it was the families of 9/11 in the weeks immediately following 9/11, the families of 9/11 that first suspected that the government and the media were telling a massive series of lies. And it was the architects, engineers, and firemen. And then the pilots and intelligence professionals like myself who ultimately rolled in and put together a story. And at phibetaiota.net, you can find my a post by Mini-Me that summarizes it all with the headline, Dick Cheney did it. Basically, 13 countries warned us in advance. We covered up all of the evidence. We took over the plot. Dick Cheney scheduled a counterterrorism exercise 3 months in advance so that he could control and orchestrate the entire day. The towers were hit by drones. It was all fabricated. The explosives inside of the World Trade Center were pre-positioned. The dogs were removed 2 weeks prior and not allowed back. All of the video evidence, all of the audio evidence, it's all quite compelling. So like the JFK Warren Commission, the 9/11 Commission was a complete fabrication. It was at best childish clowns, and it was at worst absolute pre-planned treason. And I absolutely agree there needs to be another investigation. So my open letter to Donald Trump seeks to arm him with 7 specific things he can do to bring the public on side and to bring the truth on side and to become the best informed man on the planet. And the jury's out. There's absolutely no indication that my open letter has reached Donald Trump or Donald Trump's son, who is probably going to take over the business if Trump is successful at being elected. There's no indication. And so I honestly don't know. But I will say today that given the choices that we have in the United States, Donald Trump is the only possible choice as a disruptor of the two-party tyranny.
And that's exactly what we need, a disassembling of this duopoly, the two-party tyranny, as you called it, and the power handed back to the people. In terms of, I guess, Donald Trump's support for the Israeli occupation of Palestine, the Gaza, the basic genocide of those people. Do you think that's strategy?
Look, again, I mean, Trump's advisors right now are a mixed lot, and a number of them aren't well known. So I don't know. So until the day comes when Donald Trump tells me that I get to be his chief of staff for intelligence, strategy, and policy, I will not know. And I'm not expecting that. I'm not holding my breath. But I will tell you this. Donald Trump, A, knows that there are only 9 million Jewish voters in the United States of America. He does not need the Jewish vote to win, nor does he need Jewish money. I mean, I think there is absolutely a need to cut a deal with Sheldon Adelson, which Trump has done. There is an absolute need to have a two-state solution. There is an absolute need to draw a line from Gaza to Jericho and create the Palestine state that was stolen from them. There's a need to have Jerusalem as an international city. There are all of these needs, and they include the need to stop paying $30,000 a year for every Israeli man, woman, and child out of the U.S. Treasury, which is insane. There is a need to stop funding the Arab dictators, including Saudi Arabia. So my personal view is that Trump is playing this one day at a time. He's a smart man. He's a very, very, very calculating, smart man. And so I personally say that anyone who underestimates Donald Trump is basically going to have their ass handed to them. On balance, I think that Trump wants to do the right thing. And I really think his wife is a class act. And that was the big surprise for me. Because what I see in Trump's family and what I see in Trump's wife and the way that she's being a mother is, for me, proof positive that Trump's foundations are well set.
Well, let's hope so. Let's hope that he really does.
That's true. It's a crapshoot. I'll tell you what, if Donald Trump is not elected, and what I've tried to do with Trump is show him that it's not enough to win the election. You also have to break the back of the two-party tyranny in Congress. Now, I want Speaker Ryan to continue to be Speaker of the House. I continue to believe that the Republican and Democratic parties need to be twin pillars. But there are 20 to 30 seats being vacated in Congress, and I am the top integrated electoral reformer in the United States of America. I lectured Occupy on this. My 6-minute video went viral. I subsequently heard from thousands of people, and I put together the 12-point plan for integrated electoral reform, including paper ballots and exit interviews, so that we put Diebold out of business, okay? Because this election is going to be characterized by massive fraud unless we have an Electoral Reform Act first. So I've tried to show Trump that what he needs to do is pass an Electoral Reform Act so that the election cannot be stolen from him. And one of the things the act will point out is that Bernie Sanders has refused 8 times to introduce this act into the Senate. And this act, the 12th provision, ends superdelegates. So Bernie Sanders is obviously not interested about becoming the Democratic nominee. He's interested about playing his theatrical role up to the very last minute. And my prediction is that Elizabeth Biden, Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren will emerge from the Democratic conference as the consensus nominees, and Bernie Sanders will be given a bigger office in the Senate because he's a nobody, frankly. He's a fake socialist. He was defeated by the Democrats one time when they ran a serious challenger against him. He crapped in his pants and went begging to the Democrats saying, if you never again throw a serious challenger against me, I promise to be your Pratt boy as a fake independent. And so it has been. Sanders has never done a serious piece of legislation in his lifetime that I know.
Well, we'll get back to electoral reform in a moment because that's something really good to explore. But whilst you're on Sanders, he, as far as I understand it, he has given his nomination to Clinton. And if he was really for, reform of Wall Street and the banking sector and multinational tax evasion and all the things that have really been a cancer on the system and the health and vitality of the people on the planet, then I would imagine that he would stand up and say, no, that is not okay. You are not getting my nomination. You are status quo, part of the establishment, and I will never, ever support you. The other
let me make a confession. I have actually pitched every single one of the presidential candidates except Hillary Clinton. And I've published at Amazon and online, I've published plans for John Kasich and Michael Bloomberg and Bernie Sanders. And I have to tell you, Bernie Sanders was my first stop. I approached Bernie Sanders in 2012 and 2013 after I stopped my election effort in 2012. Bernie Sanders, the highest I ever got was his political director in Vermont who promised to present my proposal to Bernie Sanders. Had Bernie Sanders listened to me and made electoral reform the key issue in this past 2 years, that electoral reform demands, among other things, that each president be allowed to select a nonpartisan, transpartisan cabinet that must be announced in advance of Election Day. And Bernie Sanders today would be running on the strength of having passed an Electoral Reform Act with a cabinet and a balanced budget announced in advance. He's incapable of doing that. This is a guy that can barely manage to mow his front lawn, okay? This is not a serious leader who is able to bring together, as Lincoln did, a team of rivals. He's not a guy who can put together a balanced budget that makes any sense. He's simply a guy with 7 sound bites that the young people, in their ignorance, have decided was the second coming of Christ. And of course, they're wrong.
The other allegation within the, I guess, truth movement or underground community is that he's just controlled opposition within the Zionist movement as well.
He's controlled opposition.
Yeah. So if he wants to, I guess, respond to those claims and free people's, sort of anxiety around it and start instituting electoral reform, I guess he could prove, those allegations.
He's not going to do that. And frankly, I'm not sure Donald Trump will either. Trump wins either way, although I personally think that he's harmed the Trump brand because right now, Muslims around the world really believe that he wants to block all Muslims. They don't get it, okay? And so I personally think that Trump's brand needs for Trump to take my 7 ideas seriously because I think he needs to grow past that. And he needs to be seen as the guy who put it all together, as the guy who beat the system. He's beating the House with its own rules. And that's Trump's genius. However, you can't just beat the House with its own rules. You have to get the money out of the House and all the way to your bank. And if Trump doesn't get a Congress that has 20 independent voters and 10 libertarian voters and 10 independent Green Constitution voters. I had to run for president to find out that we have 8 national accredited parties in the United States, 6 of which are blocked from ballot access, okay? So if Trump doesn't create a Congress in which there is a swing vote that restores Article 1, because Congress is meant to balance the power of the public, and Newt Gingrich is totally disqualified to ever be a public servant again because he destroyed Article 1 of the Constitution. He actually destroyed Speaker Wright. This is a story told in a book called The Power and the Ambition. You need for Congress to return to its members representing their constituents. Today, the members of Congress are Pratt boys for the parties. Pratt boy, for those who don't know, is the guy who used to wipe the king's ass, okay? That's what a Pratt boy is. And so members today basically are told what legislation to vote on and how to vote on it. They don't read the legislation. They don't even write it. It's written by lobbyists, okay? So we need to restore Congress as members representing constituents based on evidence and voting for legislation that is announced in advance for public scrutiny and contains no secret provisions. I mean, one of the things I expect Trump to do as President Trump is immediately cancel the Transpartisan Pacific Plan and all these other trade treaties that are absolute crap with secret provisions that essentially screw the American worker.
Yes, we should just call them resource consolidation agreements. Or
all of this is criminal conspiracy that has been legalized by a two-party tyranny in the U.S. Congress. I mean, Matt Taibbi's book, Griftopia, is just read my summary of that book. We have legalized crime in the United States of America, and that is why we are broke as a nation.
So with this electoral reform, get Wall Street and big money out of politics?
Absolutely. And I would really like people to go to phibetaiota.net. They will see there a graphic for Electoral Reform 2.0. And this graphic lists the 12 conditions, which I'm happy to list for you if you wish. But the bottom line is, okay, I will do it then. In the process of me helping lead the Occupy Electoral Reform Working Group in New Directions and in running for president, I ended up harvesting from thousands of people who in turn represented hundreds of thousands of people. Every single stakeholder in electoral reform, and that can be found at bigbatusa.org, every single stakeholder, I harvested what they've done. And it came down to 12 specific things, all of which have to be done simultaneously, all right? And this has been my beef with Lawrence Lessig, because he's always been about getting money out of politics. He's never been about anything else, okay? And Christina Tobin has always been about ballot access. Well, I'll just list them. Number one is universal registration, because right now the states have registration deadlines that are intended to block independent and drop out voters from participating. If you are automatically registered to vote, then right up until voting day, some great event could happen that catalyzes your engagement. The United States of America, the last time we had over 75% people vote was in 1896. Generally in the United States of America, 50% of the eligible voters vote. And Barack Obama has been elected and reelected by 26% of the eligible voters. Now, Donald Trump's magic is that he can bring the 70% that are outside the Republican and Democratic parties. And I've got a wonderful graphic in my open letter to Donald Trump. Basically, the Republican and Democratic parties represent 30% of the eligible voters. And other 20% are independent. And 50% are completely dropped out, okay? So I believe Donald Trump can win the election easily, even with electoral fraud, but handily if we have electoral reform, because he is going to pull all these people in.
What happens if the voting system is electronic? Is that going to matter if more people are voting?
Let me give you all 12, because you need to understand I've spent more time than anybody on the planet thinking about this, and I've put 10 years of work into one slide, which you can find at phibetaiota.net. And you'll see it on the front page. You can click on Electoral Reform Act. So number one is universal registration, which includes prisoners voting. There is absolutely no constitutional reason why a prisoner should be denied their right of citizenship. They have not given up their right to vote in committing a crime, in my view. Okay, number two is free and equal ballot access. Number three is tightly drawn districts, which is an end of gerrymandering. Okay, now that could include some virtual districts. For example, gays and lesbians don't all live in one district, and it may be that we need to factor in representation for gays and lesbians and for senior citizens. I'm not sure, and I don't have all the answers. I'm just saying we need to have not only tightly drawn districts, but we also need to think about, should there be some means of assuring representation for special groups that need extra protection. Free and equal public funding, which you just mentioned, okay? So that's number 4. Free and equal media access. I'll bet you right now Hillary Clinton is praying for free and media equal access, because she can't hold it. I mean, when people look at Hillary Clinton, they see a fat lesbian who can't keep her husband happy, who's a dishonest crook, who's a warmonger, who, oh, by the way, Clinton's private server, that was not about violating secrecy. That was about conflict of interest. Wayne Madsen has broken the story on Hillary Clinton and her private server. She was using the private server as a communications channel to cut deals in which the Clinton Foundation was receiving tens of millions of dollars for decisions that Hillary Clinton would then implement within the government. The private server was not about indiscretion with U.S. secrets. The private server was about committing treason while a U.S. government employee. Okay?
That's just amazing. It's amazing that she's even running for president. It just shows where
this is how bad our system is. So let me quickly come back to free and equal media access, inclusive debates. I mean, I love Jill Stein, who's running for the Green Party, and Gary Johnson. I let Gary Johnson drive my 1964 red MGB when we were campaigning together in New Hampshire briefly. Okay, every accredited national party plus at least 2 independents should be by law included in every national debate without any question. The Republican and national, the U.S. debates used to be run by the League of Women Voters, who not only ran them including 3rd, 4th, and 5th parties, but they also asked questions that were not provided in advance. The Republican and Democratic parties came in and stole the debates from the League of Women Voters, who lacked integrity in allowing that to happen. Had I been president of the League of Women Voters, I would have said, look, assholes, not only is this not going to happen, you ain't going to get any sex until we put this right. No man in America is going to get laid until we get our debate back. The League of Women Voters lacked the integrity to go to the mattresses, as you will, an American criminal phrase. We go to the mattresses. That means we put mattresses in all these unlisted apartments all over town so that we can send our shooters out. The League of Women Voters wasn't ready to play hardball, okay? The debate commission today is a criminal commission. It absolutely has no right to run the debate, and the Electoral Reform Act would restore the League of Women Voters or some other completely independent capability, and it would insist that every presidential candidate appoint a cabinet in advance of election, and we have cabinet-level debates as well. So ministers of agriculture, ministers of state, ministers of defense, ministers for the interior, law enforcement would be required to debate one another. And there's no prohibition against a particularly stellar individual being on more than one cabinet. Okay? You don't have to swear loyalty. For example, Joe Stiglitz, for me, is a great economist. He absolutely should be, considered by both Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Okay, so cabinet debates is one of the more interesting innovations. Open primaries. Open primaries break the back of the two-party tyranny because the closed primaries are manipulated primaries. Okay, election day should be a holiday, and there should be free public transport, because there are too many hardworking people who cannot vote because they either cannot afford to leave work or they cannot afford to go out of their way to vote. Okay? Paper ballots and exit polls. Period. That is non-negotiable. All right? End winner take all voting. This is a big one because you want people to be able to vote their heart. You want people to be able to vote for Jill Stein, the Green candidate, but have a second and third choice so that the actual final tally does two things. It provides for public recognition of how many people wanted Jill Stein to be president, and it provides for an actual majority favorite emerging out of this vote. And all of this is transparent, okay? And then finally, legislative process integrity. There should be no legislation voted on that is not published in advance for public scrutiny. And of course, it must have no secret provisions. And then the 12th one used to be a constitutional convention in 2 years, but I've changed that. I changed that about several months ago. It mandates that all delegates for federal elections shall be won proportionally with no superdelegates or other forms of party unique manipulation. Now, I absolutely guarantee you that if electoral reform is passed tomorrow, two good things will happen in the United States of America, and it will set the standard for the rest of the world. Number one, Donald Trump will be elected president if he picks his cabinet wisely, which I'm not sure he can do, but I hope he can. And number two, no matter who is elected president, we will have a multi-party Congress that is no longer the prisoner of the two-party tyranny. We will restore integrity to the legislative branch. We will restore Article 1 of the Constitution, which is the balance of powers article. So I'm about electoral reform. I'm not about getting Donald Trump elected. Although if he hires me, I'll gladly help him. But I'm about electoral reform. And so for me, the win-win for America is electoral reform passed in time to impact on this election. And it will set a gold standard for the rest of the world. I mean, the Commonwealth, you guys, it's time you break the back of the monarchy. You are way overdue for electoral reform in Australia, Canada, and everywhere else.
And it's definitely how we feel too. There are still people sucked into the duopoly and the false choice illusion of left-right, but there are many people who understand this now, that the banking and corporate interests and lobbyists and whatnot do control policy direction. The employees, the politicians are now the employees of not the people like they were designed to be, but of these corporate masters, the oligarchy. So I know how you just described the electoral reform isn't necessarily all applicable to somewhere like Australia, but I'm sure if we adapted quite bloody easily to ensure that we have independence and a widespread array of representatives that are designed to represent their electorate, not just the party.
Right, but let me tell you what the home run is. And Plato said this. There's a wonderful book by Will and Ariel Durant, The Lessons of History. Plato understood that the single most important responsibility for a democratic government was to assure that the education of its citizens was pure and truthful and ethical. The West has been educating its citizens so that they will be stupid servants and responsive factory workers. And so we have failed to educate our people. And this is why homeschoolers tend to do better. It is absolutely essential that after electoral reform is passed, one of the first priorities, apart from financial reform, be educational reform.
Yep, well, I 100% agree. And we're not just talking about critical thinking and questioning what isn't working and what should be how we should move forward in terms of the system. But it's also just general life skills, survival skills, emotional regulation skills, just the general quality of life that the inner sort of realm can manifest if you're given the right platform to do so. So education is definitely a big one. And as you mentioned, the financial. Now, I just want to quickly move on to something you said earlier, which was around publicly funded sort of election cycles, the capacity for an independent to be able to access some public funds. Now, there are huge problems with the tax system. Many call the tax system a form of enslavement, particularly in the libertarian.
Oh, I would eliminate all taxes. I mean, I've proposed in my letter to Trump that he adopt the automated payment transaction tax, which is a fractional tax on all transactions, 90% of which are not taxed today because those 90% are financial transactions.
That's right.
By the bank.
And so
we eliminate income taxes. We eliminate all taxes, including estate taxes, except for the APT tax. Now, when I say we eliminate the estate tax, I think there needs to be a come to Jesus meeting with the Rothschilds and all of these wealthy families with inherited wealth. Because I'll tell you something, I have met some of the inherited wealth trust fund babies, and these are some of the stupidest people on the planet. They are actually dangerous because their stupidity is enhanced by their money. So there needs to be some kind of settling. But on balance, I believe that we need to eliminate all taxes, including the estate tax, and implement the automated payment transaction tax. Now, there's also one very important flourish that I have added to that, which is that the tax rate is set by the public in a national ballot. What that really means is you can't go to war unless the public agrees to raise that national tax to pay for the war.
I think it's definitely the way to go. I think it's called the Robin Hood tax in some circles. We call it this. We've got a party in Australia called the Australian Sovereignty Party, who, funnily enough, want to dissolve all political parties if they get the power to do so. But they've got something called the debit transaction tax, and they've just put it as 2%. And when
actually under Tobin, it's 0.0006%. Well, 2% is way too much.
Well, given our economy, we've only got $50 trillion in transactions per year. So the speculation isn't as big in terms of derivatives markets and whatnot, stocks and whatnot, as elsewhere. So we've calculated that after many of those transactions cease, because a lot of them will not continue given that they get being taxed on it, we're going to end up at around 38 trillion, which will work out about $750 billion per year. So still an increase in tax revenue, but much fairer for everybody, where multinationals and business get taxed fair and people only get charged 2% tax. So that's a pretty good bloody system, if you ask me.
Well, let me give you one other point, which we may not have time to get to, but I think it's very important, which is that if you go to open source everything engineering, which was one of the topics that we were going to talk about, my book, The Open Source Everything Manifesto, it's now been documented that open source everything engineer reduces the costs of everything to 10% of what you're paying now. So solar energy, water desalination, building construction, just about everything, including, I think, salaries, comes down to 10%. Now, I absolutely love some of the stuff that's being done in Australia, particularly those big sunshine farms outside of Perth, where they're using solar energy to desalinate water and to heat, and they've just created this massive vegetable industry in the middle of nowhere. Now, I personally have calculated the cost of moving 1 million Somalis to a place that has dirt, sunlight, and seawater, and it came down to a one-time cost of $500 per person. Okay? Nobody else has done this. So one of the things you need to calculate, and I think I mention this in part because I think that a wise Australian government would be dealing very, very closely with the Indonesian government and the Sultan of Brunei. And it would be sponsoring a school of future-oriented design and hybrid governance. And it would actually be creating a regional development plan, which would, among other things, close the Strait of Malacca to major ships that are just an environmental disaster waiting to happen. It would close down all of the environmental abuses that are taking place now in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea. And it would turn the Australian desert into a lush oasis, while creating a quality of life in Indonesia that ends the threat forever of an Indonesian refugee influx.
Yep, there's an absolute ton that we could do. The Green the Desert project and building some pipelines and whatnot. I'd love to see that happen. I'd also love to see, a little bit more respect for our environment and water basin and whatnot, and start looking at some of these alternative energy sources, including free energy. But look, I could talk for a long time about that. But before we go, let's move to open source intelligence, open source everything manifesto. What is it? What is it really about? What's it trying to achieve? Is it around accountability, transparency? Please describe what the open source technology and philosophy thinking is actually about.
Well, a guy was asked to describe his Nobel Prize work in 30 seconds, and he said if it was worth the Nobel Prize, it shouldn't be able to be described in 30 seconds. So read the damn book. The Open Source Everything Manifesto is online at Amazon. It's very inexpensive. There is an extract that is free online. There's an awful lot of stuff that's free online. If you look up Open Source Everything Manifesto, you'll get to many of the best quotes and extracts and so forth. But here's the important part. Open source software was the first open. And open source intelligence, which I pioneered around the world, was the second open. And then open source hardware was the third open. In my book, I list over 60 opens. And we have recently agreed at the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, and people can go to phibetaiota.net and they'll see the 9 opens under a label for one of the widgets is called the Open Source Agency. Okay, so the 9 opens are open data, open decision support, open governance, open software, open provisioning, which includes free solar energy, free water desalination, and free pressed brick construction. So everybody can have free power, free water, and free housing using open sources. And then open manufacturing, open infrastructure, which is actually about the cyber infrastructure, open health, and then open space. And for each of those, we've identified 3 priority areas for development. And so this totality of 27 priority sub-areas is where I think all governments need to be going. And what I have proposed to the United States government is that they create an open source technologies agency to serve as a national innovation engine. And I would certainly propose that Australia consider that, but I don't think Australia can afford it. So I would say to Australia, cut a deal with Indonesia and ask the Sultan of Brunei to fund the open source technologies agency that will meet the needs of the region.
I guess we could also fund it through some sort of public central bank as well. All right, look, I think we could talk for hours, Robert, but what I'll do is, I guess we've come to the hour, so is there anything that we've missed? Is there anything really important that you want to talk about before we go?
Yeah, I have no salary, pension, or savings. Anybody that wants to make a donation, there's a donate button at phibetaiota.net. And I do receive donations from Australia, and every donation gets an email from me that is not only a receipt, it's the beginning of a conversation. So I work for all of you if you wish me to.
Well, the analysis, the intelligence, the really well thought out approach to dealing with these, again, these social environmental issues. We're going to be automating 40% of our work for our jobs in the next bloody 10 to 15 years. We've got a huge series of challenges that are going to face us. And I don't see any innovation, any forward thinking, any critical analysis on what reality is right now by the Australian government, by our politicians, or by politicians and governments worldwide. So I think these sorts of technologies, these sorts of informational packages, such as open source and electoral reform, are a really positive step into the future for the health, the vitality, the and the general prosperity of the world's citizens. So,
well, look, you guys, I'll tell you something. There's no reason why you guys can't come up with $10,000 to bring me out there to speak. And I would absolutely love it if your listeners decided that they wanted me to come to Australia to raise some hell face to face.
Well, you're definitely more than welcome. So for those who want to read into Robert's work further, robertdavidsteele.com. He talked about Phi Beta Iota, which is PHIBETAIOTA.net. I'll put that in as a link in the description below. And if you want to check out his many books, please just Google his name online and really get across what work he's trying to represent and push onto for the future of humanity. Thanks again for joining me, Robert. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I'm honored. Bye-bye.